Tonight our topic is the future of the world economy. And our guest is Professor Richard N. Cooper of Harvard. I'm going to take the next 50 minutes or so to give you the highlights of his career. He is, as most of you know, he's a graduate of Oberlin. Our good friend Dan Berger is also, Phi Beta Kappa. Master's degree, economics, London School of Economics and Politics, political science, and a PhD from Harvard. Taught at Yale for a dozen years, served as provost for 2 years. Was in the Carter administration as an undersecretary of state for international economics. Has been at Harvard as the Moritz Boas Professor of International Economics since 1981. His academic career is obviously notable. A dozen books or so, some edited, when you glance at the subject matter, cover almost every aspect of international economics. So there is, without any question, a grand purview of international economics, looked at very carefully. And it's an ongoing thing. He continues, as many of you know, as the book reviewer for the, or the editor of the book review section of Foreign Affairs. The picture one gets is serious coverage of most of the areas of international economics and an ongoing in-depth awareness of the profession. He's been in the practical world, as I mentioned. He's been at the State Department. He's held other government posts. He served as the director of numerous organizations. He's been a director on some of the major funds and private organizations. In short, it's been a very, very active career in public life, as well as a wonderful academic career. And so I will not take the full 50 minutes that he deserves, but instead merely present to you Richard N. Cooper.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I used to visit Baltimore regularly. My father lived here for many years and used to spend Christmas holidays with my kids in Baltimore, and it's a great pleasure to come back and talk to you all. When I talk about the future of the world economy, I usually take a long-term view, and my guess is that in today's moment, I'm not going to get away with that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by saying something about the current situation that we find ourselves in, but I don't want to neglect the long-term view, even though they don't seem to be well connected, and so I will end up making some longer-term remarks about the major underlying trends in the world economy. But if we stay with the present for a moment, I don't have to tell you all, even if you don't read newspapers, we are actually living through an extraordinary time. A few of you are old enough, Bob Bowie is an old and distinguished friend of mine, to remember the 1930s. But the nearest parallel to the period that we're now in terms of the risk aversion, to use an economist term, flight to safety and an aversion to risk of the financial institution is 1931. You have to go back to 1931 to find a comparable period, and there was a comparable period actually in 1931 in which the banking system essentially froze up. And then, you know, that had a number, I won't repeat the history of the Great Depression, but you have to go back that far to find a period like this in which various pieces of the financial market, fortunately not all of the financial market, various pieces of the financial market have literally frozen, and they've frozen for reasons of, technically it's called counterparty risk, but it's an extreme degree of risk aversion in which financial institutions went from a period recently, 2005, 2006, even early 2007, in which of great euphoria, I think is the only way to describe it, euphoria in the financial community, to a period of significant despondency at the present time, a tremendous mood swing which influences behavior to the detriment of not only our economy, but economies around the world. There are three important differences between now and 1931, all positive in my view. One is we are not on the gold standard. There, when people got scared, they converted their money into gold. Not only here, but in Europe. The panic was really more in Europe than in the United States initially in 1931. We're off the gold standard. So from a financial point of view, the system is closed. There's no outside money to which people can escape. So they can change the form in which they hold their money, but it's all inside the system. That's a big plus. The second big plus is that governments are a lot bigger now than they were in the early 1930s. And I know there's a lot of ambivalence in the American public about the size of government, but from an economic point of view, big government is a stabilizing factor, not a destabilizing factor. So the expenditure by government is not likely to buy. I'm talking now about the federal government because state governments are in a different situation. And that's an important stabilizing factor. It's moved from, I mean, to put some numbers on it, roughly 3 or 4% to roughly 22% of the economy in terms of expenditure. That's a stabilizing element. And the third element the third difference is that we actually know how to use government, or we think we do, I think we do, some people disagree, to use government actions in a stabilizing way, proactively. The size of government by itself is just a stabilizer, even if government doesn't do anything. But we know, thanks to the Keynesian revolution, I know that's a bad word in the minds of some people, but it should not be. This was an important revolution in thinking that is associated with the name of John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, but in fact a lot of people, Simon Kuznets in the United States and others, were involved in it. The whole system of national economy, the thinking about a national economy as a national economy instead of just a bunch of households and firms, dates from the 1930s. And that's what I mean by the Keynesian revolution. Conceiving the economy as a whole, the subject of macroeconomics was born at that time. And we think we know, our knowledge is not perfect to be sure, but we think we know much better than they did back in 1931 how to use government proactively to help cushion the downturn which is going to come. But the question is how, I mean, it's here. The question is how deep is it going to be? And that will be heavily determined, in my view, by government policy. And in these days, and that's a topic that's appropriate for this group, not just in the United States, although the United States remains far the largest national economy in the world, with a reasonably coherent decision-making apparatus. Europe, taken as a whole, is roughly the same size as the United States, but Europe does not have a cohesive decision-making apparatus, although they are groping toward it. And one of the interesting things in the coming months we have to think of these days, not years, in the coming months, is whether Europe can get its act together collectively in terms of the proactive use of government to help stabilize the economy, because the European economies are in at least as bad shape, arguably worse, than the United States is. Maybe I say a little bit about how we got into this mess. It was a surprise to everyone. I don't know of anyone who foresaw the situation we're now in. We always have Cassandras. There were people who saw the possibility of a housing crisis. There were people who foresaw the possibility of a credit card crisis. There were people who looked at the large global imbalances and saw them as a source of potential disaster. Surprisingly, they have not figured in a significant way in in the current situation. So there have been a lot of, but no one foresaw the rapid unwinding of financial markets that took place, starting with the housing crisis, but then the markets literally freezing up. My colleagues in the economics profession teach, markets are, if not perfect, nearly perfect, right? And they always foresee what they can foresee with the information that's currently available, and they operate in a reasonably smooth way. And that's been our experience until August of 2007. Then we thought at various times we patched things together in August of 2007, in December of 2007, then in March with Bear Stearns, then in August, and then things came apart in September of 2008. I identify three sources of the subprime mortgage crisis. Now, this has gone way beyond the subprime mortgage crisis, but that's where it started. And interestingly enough, at least arguably, each of the three sources taken by itself was a positive development and was hailed as a positive development. The first was the securitization of mortgages. Mortgages, some of you will remember, used to be the most local financial instrument. You went to your local bank, you showed them the deed or the prospective deed to your house. The local banker looked you in the eye and looked at your statement, and he decided whether you were creditworthy, and he lent money against your house's collateral and against you as a character, and the bank held the loan to maturity. 30 years on the books of the local bank. Well, starting about 2 decades ago, we began to package these mortgages, and that involved a certain degree of standardization, which any of you who have taken out a mortgage during this period will have experienced the frustration of having to fill out those forms. Those forms actually had a purpose, which was to standardize the mortgage so they could be packaged into bonds, mortgage-backed bonds they're called, and sold into the capital market. This was a very positive innovation in the American financial system. It opened up the housing market, very local collateral, to the national and, as it turns out, international capital market. So taken by itself, that was a positive. And it not only opened it up to a wider range of capital, but it made the instruments much more liquid and hence much more attractive because they could be traded, whereas the old-fashioned mortgage couldn't be traded at all. So that was a very positive development taken by itself. The second source of the difficulty was low long-term interest rates. Those of you in the financial world will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who are not may not know. But just to give you 2 examples, mortgage rates in 2000 were 8% on the typical standard mortgage. By 2003, they were down to 5.8%. Now, on a 30-year mortgage, that makes a huge difference in the monthly payment. And I have one friend who works for the Boston Fed, so he's financially savvy. He refinanced his mortgage 4 times as interest rates kept coming down, kept lowering his monthly payments. And many people did that. It opened up the possibility of home ownership to many more people to have such low interest rates. Why did we have low interest rates? Because of Chinese savings, of Japanese savings, German savings, Swiss savings, Singapore savings. There are a number of countries around the world that save much more than they invest. And those savings went into the world capital market. This is not a U.S. phenomenon. It is a worldwide phenomenon that long-term interest rates came down. People these days, I noticed, are blaming the Fed for having maintained interest rates, low interest rates, too long. I can say with confidence, because I'm on an advisory committee to the Boston Fed, that if I had been in charge, I would have raised short-term interest rates maybe 9 months before they actually did. So I think they held short-term interest rates too low too long, but not greatly too long, just a little bit too long. But the point I'm making is this is long-term interest rates. The Fed does not control long-term interest rates. It controls short-term interest rates. Long-term interest rates these days with a global capital market are a global phenomenon. And so we Americans were enjoying the benefits of excess savings. Bernanke at one point called it a savings glut. I don't actually like that term, but it was excess savings in the rest of the world, and it was coming to countries like the United States, Britain, Australia, Spain, a number of countries where their demand, particularly the demand for housing, was especially buoyant. Well, who can complain about long-term interest rates? Low long-term interest rates, that sounds like a good thing. Historically, it has been a good thing. The third dimension, which is more ambiguous, is that we, during this period, considerably relaxed the criteria for lending for mortgages. And at the time, that was actually hailed. It was hailed by our president, among other people. It was permitting, along with low long-term interest rates and the securitization of mortgages, they all reinforce one another, it was permitting people who couldn't afford to own their own homes to own their own homes. And during this period, American home ownership, which has always been high by international standards, about 65% of Americans own their own homes or condos, went up to 69+%, just short of 70% during this period. And that was hailed as a big plus. Give Americans a stake in the system, give them some property. They develop homeowner's eye, so when they hear a dripping water, they don't just ignore it, as many renters do. They actually say, Jesus, that can cause a lot of trouble. And they go after the dripping water and so forth. So that by itself was considered a big plus. But what we've discovered during this episode is that there can be too much of a good thing. And with these three things interacting together, the securitization of mortgages, the low long-term interest rates, which is a plus for borrowers, but a minus for lenders, and the relaxation of lending standards interacted in a very toxic way. And of course, we went overboard. I mean, we took the mortgage-backed securities, which were a good idea, and we packaged them into something called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, a different kind of bond. And we even took CDOs and packaged them into what are called CDOs squared. And the rating agencies rated them, and they did it in a very clever way, which made at least the better tranches attractive to insurance companies and pension funds and so forth, who were, in this era of long-term interest rates, were reaching for yield. So I set a target back there whenever of 7%, and now interest rates are only 4%. How am I going to reach my 7%? Well, I'll go for some of these more newer and attractive in terms of their rating, exotic. It's true that I don't really understand them completely, but the rating agencies bless them, and they must know what they're doing, right? And so it's okay for me, a life insurance company, to invest in them, or a pension fund, or Harvard University endowment fund to invest in them. And similarly, with the relaxation of lending standards, I mean, in the circumstances, it seemed like a good idea, but it went too far. And so we have many examples now of people who are getting loans not as traditionally on 85% of a conservative valued house, but 100% of a generously valued house. And the expectation was that housing prices would go up forever, no problem. If it's 100% now, it'll only be 90% 3 years from now at the rate house prices are going up, and they've gone up for the last 8 years, thanks in part, by the way, to this decline in interest rates. If you do the economics, a decline in long-term interest rates will raise the value of all long-term assets. So we got ourselves into a period of euphoria where nothing can go wrong, right? Wrong. Especially in a period of euphoria, you have to worry. And the incentive system in the financial community, it has to be said, was just screwy. I mean, the incentive system placed a big premium on short-term results and very little, if any, penalty for long-term negative results. And so the mortgage brokers, their interest was in making the deal. not in the soundness of the mortgage. And if the mortgage could be packaged into a security, the originator of the mortgage, who did some lending against it, well, I have to worry about it for the next 6 months, but once it's packaged, it's off my books. And so there was the financial incentive system was screwed up with this strong emphasis on short-term performance and underrating long-term performance. The really interesting thing about, I said that mortgages that were the quintessentially local instrument, it showed up first. Where? Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, that's based in Hong Kong. It's a British bank based in Hong Kong. Why are they running into trouble? Well, they held a lot of mortgage-backed securities, and they were having trouble valuing them. And then it showed up in 2, 3 mutual funds run by Paribas, the leading, or BNP it's called now, the leading French bank. A German bank turned out to hold a lot of these securities and ran into such trouble it needed serious help by the German government. A British mortgage lender didn't hold any of these securities, but relied very heavily on the short-term commercial paper market. And when the commercial paper market froze in August of 2007, Northern Rock was in deep trouble, got a lot of help from the Bank of England, and was nationalized in February of this year. And so it turns out this is just Exhibit A for the globalization of financial markets. What historically was a very local financial transaction between you and the local bank with your house as collateral turns out to have global consequences in today's world. So it's just an indication of the globalization of financial markets. So I want to say a few more things about the short-term situation. I think that we are very fortunate in the United States, or I would say the world is fortunate, that as we have as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Ben Bernanke, a Princeton economist who in his scholarly days, which are past now, focused on the Great Depression. And he knows much better than most other people how weaknesses in the financial system can spill over into the real economy and cause huge damage. And so he's very sensitive to that possibility. And I just think it's useful to have that knowledge at our high decision-making levels. And I have to say I'm very complimentary of the Federal Reserve, and of central banks in general, include the Bank of England and even the European Central Bank, although it's been sort of dragged reluctantly into this. But I think the Fed has acted with a speed and a magnitude and a degree of unorthodoxy, if I can put it that way, that none of us had reason to expect 18 months ago. And I think it's a very positive development. By unorthodoxy, they haven't broken any laws as far as I know. The Federal Reserve Act, fortunately, unlike the Maastricht Treaty, which sets the framework for the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Act, which your representatives all passed, the recent version is 1978, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, is very general in the authorities that it gives to the Fed, and I think that's highly desirable. And it charges the Fed with doing all good things, but among other things, assuring financial stability. The Maastricht Treaty, to its great deficiency in my view, charges the European Central Bank with one primary target, price stability. No mention of financial stability, which in my view is a primary objective of central banks everywhere. Now, we happen to have in the ECB seasoned central bankers at the moment, and so they know what they have to do, and they will stretch as they can their authorities to do it. But anyway, I give the high marks, but as the famous English economist, now long dead, once said, of periods like this, and speaking of monetary policy, you cannot push on a string. There's only so much that the Federal Reserve can do. I think it's been very imaginative and creative in what it's done so far, but now we're at a stage where it's infected the real economy, here, in Germany, in Japan, in Britain, in Spain, in all of the major countries, including, but it's still a question mark, China, and it's over to fiscal policy, basically. And so the big assignment, not just for Mr. Obama, President-elect Obama, is what to do concretely in the area of fiscal policy. I actually think that timeliness is very important. I don't know the I'm politically naive, I guess is one way to put it, but I do not know why he resigned from the Senate as soon as he did. He was a sitting senator in the sitting Congress until January 6th, and he could have introduced a bill as Senator Obama, which would, and I think losing 2 months is going to cost the American economy a lot. It's going to cost the American economy a lot to lose 2 months. But anyway, they'll put something together. They'll probably get it by mid-February, and then we'll see what happens next year. The optimists see a recovery in the second half of 2009. The pessimists see recovery not taking place until sometime in 2010, perhaps even late 2010. This is going to be the deepest recession since 1981-82, which was about the same as 74-75 in the U.S. And worldwide, it will probably be the deepest recession we've seen since the 1930s. It won't be comparable to the 1930s for the reasons I mentioned, but it will be the deepest recession we see since the 1930s. So it's a bad time. I want to shift gears now and talk about the longer run, which is all of the short run stuff is really fascinating to financial types like me. But for a group like this, you're presumably interested in long-term trends in foreign relations, international relations, and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit about those. And what my starting point is going to be an unusual one for talking about foreign affairs. It's demography. We pay, in my judgment, far too little attention to demography. There's a lot of information out there in demographic trends. And we, when I say we, I mean we economists, but also foreign relations specialists, spend far little attention to demography. We are living through a demographic revolution at the moment. Not so long ago, and some people even now, were concerned about exploding world population growth. But the fact is that world population growth reached its peak in the first half of the 1960s. That's yesterday's story, although there's a lot of inertia in demographic developments, and so the world population will continue to grow for several more decades, maybe even 5 decades. But world population growth is coming down. But what I want to draw your attention to is population growth in the rich countries. Europe, not just Western Europe, but including Slavic Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Japan, we all know about, but not just Japan, all of East Asia. Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, China. None of these countries is reproducing itself. So that in long-term trends, these countries are all in population decline. The second and third largest economies in the world, national economies, Japan and Germany, reached their peak populations. Japan, I think, 2005, Germany, 2006. And they are actually in decline now. Now, what we do hear a lot about is, in public discussion, is the aging of society. Because longevity is increased, thanks to advances in medical science and nutrition and so forth. We're all living longer. And furthermore, we're living healthy longer. So that disability comes eventually, but it doesn't come nearly as soon as it came 50 years ago, for example. So, and that creates big problems for pension schemes everywhere. I mean, we talk in this country about the Social Security system, but we are in relatively, underline the word relatively, we are in relatively good shape compared with the other rich countries that have an even more serious, most of them have a more serious pension problem. The focus on aging has detracted from the other end of the demographic change, which is natality or birth rates. Birth rates have fallen everywhere, and they've fallen below net reproduction rates in the countries that I mentioned. And that's especially of interest for economies, because young members, think concretely of the typical 20-year-old, is these days the most educated, the average 20-year-old, the most educated and the most flexible new entrant to the labor force. They're better educated than their elders typically, and they're more flexible both occupationally and geographically. And the number of 20-year-olds in rich countries are declining steadily, roughly, and in China, roughly at the rate of 1% a year. So they'll be 20% lower 20 years from now than they are now, roughly speaking. In this general, and that has, I think, profound implications for the nature of economies. This is the age, young adults, new household formation, demand for housing, demand for schools for their children, demands for capital as they enter the labor force to equip the new entrants to the labor force with capital and so forth. And so with declining numbers of young adults, you have a decline in the propensity to invest in most countries. With increasing longevity and Social Security pension systems in trouble, you have a tendency for peoples in these countries to save more, in Japan and Germany and other countries to save more. So you have declining investment and savings, which is some places actually rising, but usually just unchanged. So you have a growing gap between savings and investment. That's contractionary. And where have these excess savings gone? Well, they went to the United States. We have a huge current account deficit. Also Britain, also Australia, also a few other countries, but mostly Anglo-Saxon countries. We have a huge current account deficit. Many people wring their hands and lament the current account deficit. They saw it as a source of crisis, but in fact, I see it as a natural consequence of globalization of capital markets and these demographic trends, because the United States, among rich countries, stands out as a startling outlier. For two reasons. Birth rates have fallen in the United States, but they haven't fallen nearly as far as they have in the other rich countries, and we still are roughly at net reproduction, covering, births cover deaths on in demographic terms. And then in addition, we are a country of immigration. And again, by international standards, we do, in my job, a fabulous job of integrating peoples from all over the world, or more accurately, their children, into American society. We just do a very good job. We Americans are aware of all of the defects and the problems that arise locally and so forth from that. But again, in comparative standards, Japan is extremely hostile to immigrants. The Europeans are struggling with, the continental Europes are struggling with immigration and how to integrate them into society and so forth. We do a very good job. And not surprisingly, in these sweeping generalizations that I'm making, Canada and Australia stand someplace between Europe and the United States. Their birth rates have fallen more than in the United States, but they are both countries of successful immigration from the rest of the world. So Canada and Australia are sort of in-between cases. Now, the world population is continuing to grow, but all of the growth will take place in what we now call developing countries in the next 3 or 4 decades on current demographic projections. Now, I actually think this has profound implications for and we can take it in a number of different directions, but this is a group that's especially interested in foreign policy, so I'll just identify 2 branches that one could go down, starting with these demographic changes that are of relevance to foreign policy. The countries that are in steepest demographic decline, Western Europe and Japan and Korea, are our closest allies. They are the traditional allies for now half a century of the United States. How are we going to view, we Americans going to view the world in 2030 or 2040, with Europe and Japan in relative decline. I'm not suggesting that standards of living will be lower in these countries. They probably won't, unless something goes badly wrong. They probably won't. But the number of young adults will be in steep decline. That means recruitment into the armed forces, for example. 60-year-olds typically do not go into the armed forces. So if the number of 18-year-olds goes down from year to year, recruitment to the armed forces will be much more difficult. The fiscal situation will be severely strained because of the pension problem that I mentioned in all of these countries. We're already having trouble getting the Europeans to make what we consider necessary commitments to NATO, financial commitments to NATO. They have a genuine fiscal dilemma about what to do. And Japan, of course, we have a bilateral alliance with Japan and with Korea, but they are in similar situations demographically. So I think we need to think about what our national security relationships, we don't have to do anything about it next year, but we should begin to think about what the world's going to look like in 20 or 30 years and how we need to reshape our thinking of the world as a result of these demographic trends. By the way, Russia is a country that's in even worse demographic decline than the others, because Russia not only has had a sharp decline in natality, it's one of the few countries in the world, the others are African countries with serious AIDS problems, where longevity, far from increasing, has declined, for males especially. Females are more sensible. But males, particularly in Russia, there's been an uptick actually in the last few years, but there's been a decade-long decline in longevity in male. So Russia is in steep demographic decline, insofar as the polls in particular worry about Russia, they're going to have less to worry about 30 years from now than they do now, because the Russians won't be able to recruit anyone into the army at that time. But anyway, this is an issue. This is an issue that I think, for people who are thinking ahead, needs to. I'm not a national security guy, basically. Although, as Robbie Harris knows, I rub up against that community from time to time. But anyway, this is an issue that I think needs to think about. We need to think about. Now, the second issue is what I would call geopolitical, because that's what attracts the attention of academics and journalists, and they can write big picture stuff without thinking too concretely or operationally about it. And China's going to be the next superpower, right? That's what we read all the time. Well, I actually don't like terms like superpower because I don't know what they mean. And so I want to know concretely what China's going to look like in, let's say, 2030. So it's roughly a quarter century from now. And is China going to be a meaningful superpower? So I've done some calculations. They will not be an accurate forecast. I should explain, I based my calculations actually on projections of the U.S. Department of Energy, who does a world energy outlook annually. And the recent one for 2008 has just gone forward to 2030, so I have 2030. And the attractive thing about the Department of Energy projections, their, of course, interest is in energy. But to do energy, they have to do GDP. To do GDP, they have to do demographics, population, and so forth. So they had a set for the whole world. They have a set of projections to 2030, which is internally consistent, which is important. There are no internal contradictions, and which has the advantage of being readily available. You can just go to their website and look it up, so people can look it up and either agree or disagree. It's all out there, available to everyone. I've made some modifications, some technical modifications with these projections, which have to do with exchange rates, which the Department of Energy doesn't want to get into. Anyway, the bottom line is, using the Department of Energy projections, which is not going to be an accurate forecast, but it's a plausible projection, and it has these advantages of being internally consistent. It assumes a benign world. They haven't allowed for the situation that we're now in, for example. It assumes a benign world, assumes a peaceful world, and economically reasonably progressive world. No big depression in this period and so forth. So I think it's a plausible projection. And so what is, with my modifications, what does it actually show? Well, it shows that by 2030, China has surpassed Germany. That will happen in the next few years and become the third largest economy of the world. In the early 20s, it will surpass Japan and become the second largest national economy in the world. And by 2030, it will be just over half the size of the United States, 53% of the United States. That's with my exchange rate adjustment, which pushes them up from the Department of Energy projection. So it will be a much bigger economy. China is assumed during this period to do well. But people forget that the U.S. is also growing, can be expected to grow over this quarter century. So while China's catching up, the catch-up is not against a static U.S., it's against a growing U.S. So they'll be half the size, a little over half the size of the U.S. They will have surpassed Japan by that time, because Japan is in demographic decline. China is in demographic decline, but sort of lagged by about 10 years. So China's population will actually reach a peak on current projections in 2033. And then but the number of young adults is going down now as we speak. But against that is the number of people, the increased longevity in China. China will have a GDP roughly, insofar as one can make these comparisons, about the size of the U.S. GDP in 2005. It's going to be a big economy. And if it can tax its citizens, and you all may be interested to know, some of you may know, some of you may not know, because Americans complain endlessly about how heavily taxed we are. We are the most lightly taxed of all of the rich countries. Even the Swiss, and Switzerland's hardly a country by typical standards, even the Swiss tax themselves more than we do, modestly. Swiss are the most lightly taxed European country. When I say taxes, I'm talking about all taxes, state and local as well as federal. We are the most lightly taxed rich country. We have enormous untaxed potential in this country, which we choose for political reasons not to realize. China, in contrast, is just under 20%. We tax ourselves at about 32% GDP at all levels of government. China is about 19%, rising from year to year. So there's an issue about whether China can tax itself as much as the U.S. taxed itself in 2005. It's moving in that direction, but it's way behind. But assuming China can, the Chinese government will have the capacity to do lots and lots of things. They can have a very big military establishment. They can have lots and lots of foreign aid. They can have lots of infrastructure, which they're spending on now, and so forth. It'll be a big country. China also has this taxing problem. It's not so much with the public, because they don't have a free press and a lot of NGOs to complain about taxes, but there's a constant tension between the central government and the local authorities in China about who gets the tax revenue. And that issue was resolved tentatively in 1994 by Zhu Rongji. He went around and negotiated with each province, but as tax revenues rise slowly year by year, that tension is always there. Who gets the increment? And so these monies may not be available to the central government. We color China a uniform yellow on the map. No impression could be more misleading than the homogeneity of that yellow color on a map of the globe. China is an extremely diverse country, and the central authorities in Beijing are tenuously in control. Tenuously in control. That's a different story. But anyway, it will be a very big economy and potentially can do lots of things. It will still be much, much poorer than we are at that time in terms of per capita income, but much, much richer than they are now. Chinese in 2030 will be about 5 times richer than they are now on these projections. So, and the leadership of China, assuming they stay on their current pattern of bringing in new leaders at age 65. How old is Mr. Obama? The Chinese, to be eligible leadership, you more or less have to have reached 65, and then now they throw you out sometime in in the low 70s. The leadership of China then will have grown up with no personal memories of the revolution, not to mention the Long March, no personal memories, especially of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. They will have grown up completely in a period of prosperity, and they will be much more educated than the current leadership, at least in a formal sense. The current leadership is educated by comparison with their predecessors. Most of them are engineers, and I think we should thank we should be grateful that they're engineers. They are problem solvers. They're very pragmatic, very non-ideological, and they're problem solvers. If we have a problem, let's figure out how to solve it. And so we have to keep our eye on the evolving Chinese leadership as time goes on. So now one sometimes sees much bigger numbers than I've just given you, 55% by 2030, I think it's 45% by 2025, something like that. They are based on purchasing power parity, and I won't get into a technical discussion unless one of you asks, in which case you'll probably regret it. About the but the point I want to leave you with is get purchasing power parity out of your mind when it comes to making geopolitical comparisons. It's an irrelevant number. We had to do it for the Soviet Union because they did not have a price system worth a damn, and their exchange rate was completely artificial. But China is 90% a market economy now. The exchange rate is relevant for all of their transactions with the rest of the world. And I mention this now because I'm having an ongoing fight with both CIA and the Defense Department, because every once in a while their publications make China look huge, and it's a meaningless number. And I'm trying to persuade them that it's a meaningless number. It's based on purchasing power parity. Maybe I should stop at this point, because I'm supposed to leave some time for questions.
We wish we could go on forever. First question, yes, sir. The question is, what is the role of regulation in the relative to the economy as you've described it tonight?
I see this as an ongoing dynamic process, and the answer to your question is yes, both and. We know from now lots of historical experience that the financial market needs to be regulated. Anytime you create regulations, unless they are absolutely lock-tight regulation, I mean really a managed financial system, which we don't want, you create arbitrage possibilities. And we have lots and lots of smart lawyers and lots of smart investment bankers who are going to take the regulations as given, and they're going to find ways around them. So we have an ongoing race. It's a little bit, to make the military analogy, the analogy is between offensive and defensive weapons. We've seen over the centuries the parallel progression in both offensive and defensive weapons, and there's a kind of competition between them. Same thing is happening in the financial world. We want an innovative financial world. Innovation eventually undermines any given set of regulations, so the regulators have to keep up with them. And we in the United States, we've had a financial crisis every decade since the 1830s. Not with regularity, but on average. Every decade since the 1930s. We've had one that was really a catastrophe. That was in the 1930s. That absolutely has to be avoided. But I see financial crises as a part of the evolutionary process of a modern economy. The regulators, if we were wise, and here I'm not just talking about the technocrats, but the political system, if we were wise, we would identify in time before a crisis erupts and modify the regulations. So we'd have this parallel movement. But in fact, we're not wise. And there are reasons why we're not wise. I mean, the former, long ago, chairman of the Federal Reserve, William McChesney Market, had a very nice metaphor. He said the job of the Federal Reserve was taking away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. And the problem is our political system is incapable of taking away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. So we have to have a crisis, and then that gets the attention. The regulators may have been warning in their memos for some time, but their political bosses tend not to take them too seriously, and the political bosses of, say, the SEC, who are in Congress or the White House, tend to I mean, who wants to interrupt everything's going well, right? And so we actually need a crisis from time to time. And the challenge is to keep the crisis from doing a lot of damage. So that's the practical challenge as I see it. But I see these crises, this one is much worse than it has to be, in my view, but I see these crises as actually an intrinsic part of an ongoing evolutionary process.
Would you comment upon, the bottom line is on the accumulation of wealth in the Middle East?
And how oil affects the whole world.
Yeah.
Okay. And how oil and the energy questions affect the entire world. Yes.
Well, let me start. I'll come to the financial question in a minute, but let me start with the IEA, the Department of Energy projections, which I already alluded to in a different context. Their interest, of course, is in energy. Ultimately, GDP is just an intermediate. Growth rates are just an intermediate step. They forecast a growth in demand for what they call liquid fuels, because they're now including unconventional oil, you know, the tar sands and some of the heavier gases, which condensates in that, but it's mostly ordinary petroleum. They foresee, if I remember the numbers correctly, they foresee a growth in world demand for that between now and 2030 of just under 50%. I think it goes from 85 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels a day. They have to make some price assumptions to get there. They then make projections about non-OPEC production of oil, U.S., Canada, Russia, and so forth, and then they treat the difference as a residual, and they simply assume that OPEC will produce the residual. For OPEC, read Saudi Arabia. I mean, because Saudi Arabia is the biggest player, but others. Venezuela is second after, in terms of reserves, readily exploitable reserves. And so that's a very strong assumption. And the question is, are the Saudis making the investments that are required to meet the IEA's projections? And the answer until 18 months ago was no. They haven't made any new investments in oil. Their production in 1980, when I was in this business in the State Department, worrying a lot about energy, was 10 million barrels a day, 10.5 million barrels a day. Their production recently has been, until it's gone down now, around 10 million barrels a day. They have had no increase in production at all in, what is this, nearly 30 years. Now, they now have a program, publicly announced program, of increasing their capacity of about 2.5 million barrels a day. What will happen to that? And they've started. They've put out bids and so forth, and they have a lot of drilling rigs in there and so on. What will happen in today's circumstances, these were decisions made 2 years ago, how much they will delay that, and that remains to be seen. So I think the world does have a problem with oil. It is not peak oil. It is not running out of oil. We're not going to run out of oil. I'm an economist. We don't, practically speaking, run out of anything. Prices go up and we find substitutes and so forth. And so we're not going to run out of oil, but we may have a situation of inadequate investment in production of known oil reserves, because all of these are state companies now. They're all subject to political influence and all the complicated dynamics of domestic politics in each one of these countries. So we may well see by 2025 a much higher price of oil designed to encourage non-OPEC production, because the OPEC countries aren't responding for various reasons. Now, so that's a possibility, although I note with interest a man by the name of Maguri. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, he's a senior employee of Eni, which is the Italian state oil company. He published a book 2 years ago, which was quite interesting, on the historical and economic review of the ups and downs of the world oil market since its beginning in the 1870s. And he states a remarkably concrete statement in a historical book: the long-run price of oil is $32 a barrel. in prices of 2005. I mean, allowing for, you have to add inflation on top of that. And we're in an oil boom now. We've seen them before. It will bust like every other oil boom has busted. And sure enough, he's been right. I mean, it just busted. And no doubt he would say we'll have a few more, but if you just sort of average of this period. So his judgment is $32 a barrel, long-run price of oil as far as the eye can see. I'm not sure I note with interest his statement. I'm not sure I agree with it. But the world has a big demand for oil. In spite of all we may do about climate change, it's not going to change radically in the next 2 decades. It may change radically in the next 5 decades, but it won't change radically in the next 2 decades. Just we have such a big stock of cars and trucks out there, and other users of oil. And so we will no doubt go through another, maybe 2 more booms, oil booms and busts, before we wean ourselves from oil. This, of course, gives the Persian Gulf continues to have very high strategic importance, not only for us, but for all other oil importing countries, which among others includes China. So China will, the U.S. In 2030 is still the world's largest consumer of oil, but China is beginning to push us. I mean, they'll be up to 16 million barrels a day by then. So China has an enormous geostrategic economic interest in the Persian Gulf, and it happens to be parallel to ours. Namely, we want to keep the oil flowing, so there's room for cooperation there. Now, on the financial side, I have not myself looked at this, so I'm now reporting the judgments of others, but with a few exceptions, like the UAE and Kuwait, most of the countries are in fiscal difficulty at oil prices below $70 a barrel. It's true in spades of Iran, it's true of Russia, it's true of, which is not an OPEC country, it's true of Saudi Arabia, probably not true of the UAE or of Kuwait. And so if oil prices, well, they're up a little bit this week, but if they stay between $40 and $50, we're going to see serious fiscal problems in a number of the oil exporting countries. Couldn't happen to nicer guys than Ahmadinejad, in my view. But how they will respond to it remains to be seen. Obviously, there will be some retrenchment, but there may be also some attempt to increase. So it will make maintaining OPEC quotas more difficult to the extent that these countries are in fiscal difficulty.
We deeply regret the march of the clock, and with great hesitation and reservation, let me thank you for the privilege of hearing you.